Hi everyone.
Even after years and years.
Traditionally Tibetan, we're starting 15 minutes behind, but we'll kick things off now. Thanks for your patience. And hopefully everyone can hear me. Can everyone hear me in the back? I'll take that as a, okay. All right, I'll speak up. Thank you for coming everyone. My name is Namgyal. So I'm a student here at the LSE. It's really nice. Normally I'm surrounded by people looking at finance formulas and maths equations, so it's great that we can change the topic. I'm speaking as the president of the LSE Tibet Society. We've got some members here in the room as well. I'd like to welcome our General Secretary, Kunsang Tsepo, here as well. We've sadly not got our treasurer with us today. She's in India, but Riang Dewatsang is a key member of our team as well. So what we do as LSE Tibet Society is we try and host or arrange interesting discussions on all things Tibet, trying to bring Tibet to people that might not know much about it and to give scholars like those that we have today a platform to speak up on what they're experts on. So today we have a really interesting and important conversation on Xizang, Tibet, and Pe, three different names for the same region. First and foremost, I would like to thank Dala Ngaongla from Londonney. I think we can all agree they've done an amazing job. They've created this from nothing. So maybe another round of applause for the duo. And also, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists. We have Dr. Tirang Tokgyal, Ms. Kate Saunders, Dr. Xiao Zhang, and also our moderator, Dr. Taro Lamo. So our first speaker, Dr. Xiao Zhang, is a distinguished activist scholar and former prisoner of conscience, recognized for his courageous role in the 1989 pro-democracy movement in China. Forced into exile, he now resides in London, where his work continues to champion democracy, human rights, and social justice. Dr. Zhang's academic expertise spans a diverse array of fields, including politics, media, social movements, democratization, feminism, law in China, and Hong Kong. His work also tackles issues of autonomy, sovereignty, and self-determination. He is deeply engaged in the study of international human rights, mechanisms, and comparative political institutions. Among his many contributions to scholarship, he has authored citizen publications in China before the internet, and has published numerous articles and blogs that inspire and inform activists worldwide. Our next speaker, Kate Saunders, is a renowned English author, journalist, and specialist in Tibetan and Chinese affairs. Her articles have been featured in prestigious publications such as The Times, The Sunday Times, The Washington Post, and The Independent. Kate has served as an analyst, writer, and spokesperson for the Tibet Information Network, and held the position of Director of Communications at the International Campaign for Tibet. Her expertise has been sought in various media outlets, including Radio Australia and the BBC World Service. So Kate's profound knowledge and dedication make her an invaluable contributor to today's discussion. Our final speaker, Dr. Tirang Tokgyal, brings a wealth of academic and also personal insight into the Sino-Tibetan discourse. Having studied in India, the United States, and the United Kingdom, Dr. Tokgyal earned his BA in political science, a master's in Pacific International Affairs, and a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. So a full circle moment. His research focuses on critical areas such as Chinese foreign policy and security policy, Sino-Tibetan relations, and China's nationality policies. He is the acclaimed author of China and Tibet, The Perils of Insecurity, and is currently working on a book titled China's Tibet Policy, Securitizing Self-Identity, Securing Tibet. His extensive body of work and scholarly articles shed light on complex geopolitical and cultural dynamics, making him another invaluable voice in today's discussion. Our moderator, can't forget, Dr. Taro Lamo, served inspiringly as Culture Secretary and Youth Coordinator of the Tibetan community in Britain, and is currently the National Coordinator for the Tibetan Government in Exile's Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group, or VTAG. And Dr. Taro Lamo will be guiding this important conversation. Before I pass over a few more words, me personally, I really see tonight's discussion as more than just an academic exercise. The terms Tibet, Xizang, and Pe are not just linguistic variations, but represent very distinctive and different narratives. They hold profound implications for identity, sovereignty, and the ongoing quest for cultural and political self-determination. So I hope that in today's discussion we uncover how Tibet, Xizang, and Pe resonate within Western, Chinese, and Tibetan discourses and what they signify for our future. As the LSE Tibet Society, we are deeply committed to fostering dialogue. I encourage you all to participate actively during the audience Q&A session. Tonight, let's have debate, let's speak our minds, let's try and refrain from judgment, and let's use this opportunity. So before I hand over, let me thank you all again for being here. I think your presence reflects your care and commitment to understanding Tibet and its global significance. Thank you once again, and without further ado, I'll pass the floor to our moderator, Dr. TibetanHeritage.
Tashitele, and thank you, Namgye, for the excellent introduction. So as he said, I'm TibetanHeritage, the coordinator of the Volunteer Tibet Advocacy Group UK. I think the name says what it is in itself. So it's a group of Tibetans who've come together and in their free time are volunteering and advocating for the Tibetan cause with MPs, with our government, and raising awareness about the Tibet issue. We have a lot of our members here today, so thank you all for coming, and thank you all for taking the time on a Friday evening to come to join us for our panel discussion. So VTAG UK and LSE Tibet Society have collaborated this discussion, which is titled Unlocking of Historical, Social and Political Connotation of Tibet, Xizang and Pur. The panel discussion and question and answer session will be recorded by Londonney, and this will be published later online for the wider audience to view. So, why are we doing this panel discussion? The roof of the world, the third pole, the realm of Shambhala, the real Shangri-La, and the land of Lamas, the snowlands, the forbidden land. These are some of the many names used to describe the country Tibet. This panel discussion is organized due to public demand. We are witnessing numerous individuals and organizations getting confused with the meaning of the terms or the words that represent Tibet. The origin, political, social, and historical implications of the terms such as Tibet, Xizang, and Pur are complex, and with the help of scholars and researchers, we hope to clarify some misconceptions and misunderstandings of these terms. Recently, Professor Tsering Shakya from the University of British Columbia has published an article on this issue. He argues that Beijing's recent attempt to renaming the globally recognized name Tibet with Xizang is a tool of imperial erasure due to its anxiety over the international perception of Tibet. The renaming of Xizang, or Himalayan world, instead of Tibet has become controversial in the Guimet Museum in France. Major concerns have been raised that these are attempts to erase and distort Tibet's history and Tibetan identity. As a result, we are witnessing criticism and protests from Tibetans demanding that the museums restore the original name Tibet. An example closer to home, and actually very close to here, is the use of the Xizang Autonomous Region by the British Museum. This contradicts the historical relations between Tibet and Britain, where Great Britain recognized Tibet's autonomy prior to the occupation by China. Museums are meant to preserve history, not distort it. Their power lies in truth, transparency, and honoring all voices, for only through the honest reflection of the past can we protect the integrity of Tibet's history and Tibetan identity. Now, I'd like to quickly go through the order of events for today. Each of our guest speakers will be given 12 minutes to talk on their topic. We will then have a question and answer session where you are all invited to contribute your questions. This will be for about 45 minutes. And then we will have a 5 minutes for each of our speakers to give their concluding remarks. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Xiaozhang, our dissident Chinese scholar and expert. He will speak on the evolution of Tibet or Pur, translated into Chinese from linguistic history, as well as the difference between the official and unofficial usage of the terms. I welcome Dr. Xiaozhang.
So, good evening, Dashidele, everyone. So, it's quite an interesting topic. If you talk this topic, maybe a lot of the historical background you can look. First, maybe I'm going to talk about the history of translation of Tibet or Bod into Chinese context. I just talk the three parts. For these three parts, maybe you can look at what it means in Tibetan translated into Chinese, and how the Chinese Communist Party uses political, economic in Tibet and how the Chinese Communist Party used the international politics on Tibet. So maybe we can first go to the historical linguistic language. So it's around the 8th century. This first the Chinese use the different name. In the tongue it is called it's Wusiguo. It's actually this uses word in it's a Tang dynasty, and the Ming is used the other word is Suzhang. Today it's called it's a Tibet, and it's called the Tangute. That is a different name, but actually this name very confused. The Chinese, in history, they use a different name called the Tibetan. Why is the user this different name? We can look at something. The first, maybe you can look actually from the first is used is the Wuzang. They call the Tibetan, Central Tibetan is little, and they try to use this little part of Tibetan as call this one. And the second, you can look, this one is unofficial discourse, and the ROC, the Taiwan, use this word, is Tubo. Tubo is called the translation, the board. And Tu is a big map, is a big land. This gives the land. They try to challenge the Chinese Communist Party, use the word Xizang. And also other people use it Tubete. Actually, the Tubete is come from the Mongolia language. I use this language, but first the Chinese use character is uses quite a discrimination Chinese character. Now it's used to change the character. It's very positive means for the it's called the Tibetan. They try to give some different opinion with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese regime. That's very important. Where is it from the Xizang? Actually the Xizang, the Mongol emperor and the Qing emperor called Tibetan as Western location. So the Chinese use this language. The West is Xi, and they come from Zhang. Where is the Zhang? I just called from this one. It's Zhang from the Yusong. It's Wuzang. It's used the word. Together, this become the Xizang. That is the Chinese Communist Party and they use this word. And they like use this word. Originally, use this word reflect they claim Tibetan has been a part of China since the ocean time. They always use this term. And they use this word come from the area since occupied by Mongol emperor and the Qing emperor. They reflect the CCP regime attempt to give the history and by directly interrupted by the Mongol and the Qing emperor as part of fabric legitimacy to rule Tibet. That is why they use this word. So you can look the maybe Tibetan in map. They give the different land how is the Tibetan become since the early 20th century becomes small and small. It's actually from the historical you can look this map. And also the Chinese Communist Party occupied Tibet. They use a different rule, and they try to use its division and rule. The Chinese called it the 分而治之. Actually, they made the Tibetan divide 5 parts, and normally the reference Xizang is only mentioned before. There is only the Tibetan autonomous region. Just it's a very small one, But it's actually the other Tibetan period. They put the other province level. So that is strategy you can look. it can directly at the West, the country for raising Tibetan issue, and the Chinese can dominate the negotiation. And also the negotiation with the Dalai Lama, the use is Xizang. That means that means they can only talk the Tibetan autonomy region problem, not talk the other Tibetan area. That's the strategy. For example, maybe the Gangtor Dam can be including in administrative area in stability maintenance grid in Sichuan province. They use this Weiwen. Weiwen is just to crack down some of the Tibetan protect their land and their cultural heritage. And they use, for example, they close the German Gasa National Vocation School in Tibetan. They can say, okay, that is the Qinghai province problem. And this division is a result, a lack of the international media coverage of the Amdong in the eastern part of Tibetan and come in the eastern part and come in the eastern north of Tibet. That is the strategy. You can look at the Chinese administration division that use this strategy. This Chinese Communist Party uses language. Actually, the use of the language in different area is you use a different language. For example, the 1922 to 1946, they use self-determination and the new democracy. That main issue, they try to mobilize Tibetan and other people support the Chinese Communist Party. You can call revolution, overthrow KMT, Nationalist Party. That is the strategy. And maybe you know, the Chinese Communist Party, the discourse changed since the 1947, when the Inner Mongolia, the autonomy region, the first region they set up, they use a different strategy. They call it region autonomy and democratic centralism and democratic dictatorship. They use this language. And what it means is Chinese Communist Party system is a party emperor. Is Chinese called it 党天下. Is under you know the underworld of Weiwen, all these kings. This from the old traditional statecraft rule, and they become the CCP. And also this you just change the kings to the CCP. That is quite ironic. This one for you can reference from the Soviet model and the Nazi Germany model. So you can look maybe I talk about this one. I just going to talk about how the Chinese Communist Party uses Tibetan language. So you can look is mostly they talk about the Tibetan issue. They use this protect the Tibetan culture heritage stage. But actually, the Tibetan so big one is most the land around is 25% of the Chinese Communist Party occupy the land. So that only gave the Tibetan 4 world heritage sites in Tibet. That means they can use this strategy, and if not including this 4 places and sites, they can easily demolish and force the Tibetan move the other place. In name of development and nature conservation, that uses name. It's strategy. You can look at, understand why the recent 20 years, why the Tibetan people, so many Tibetan nominate, they try to force them to change occupation to other place. They try to push them out from their land. So I maybe this one for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Xiaojiang, for your insightful explanations, especially about the Chinese terminology and how that has actually also changed with history, and more importantly about Xizang, because that's the term that we're hearing being used at the moment. So it's really important that we have the context for that. I'd like to invite our next speaker, Ms. Kate Saunders, our China and Tibet observer, journalist, expert, and she will be speaking on the issue of the colonial naming of Tibet in a geopolitical context, and also the relationship between Tibet and Britain. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Which one is it? This one? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Tara and Nawang and Dala, and also Namgyal too. I'm really impressed that there's such a good turnout on a rainy Friday night. So thank you. So I'm going to show why language is important, linked to Tibet's place in the world and our efforts to counter China and to advocate for Tibet. And China is trying to dominate and to control the narrative on Tibet and on Buddhism as well, globally. And it's never been more important for us as Tibet advocates, as activists, to really create a compelling argument and to be ready for challenging China and to lead on telling Tibet's story. In fact, there's a phrase in China's propaganda which says we must tell well the story of Tibet. Actually, that's our job in this room. And it's shocking often to see how often on the global change stage China does succeed in framing that narrative. So Xizang, with the use of the word Xizang, China is trying to erase Tibet's historical, independent cultural footprint. And it's doing that through the colonial imposition of language. And China has developed a whole new, often incomprehensible language, political language, a bit like a sort of going into a looking glass world. For instance, using phrases like it wants to achieve long-term stability in Tibet. And that's coded political language for ensuring compliance to the CCP and crushing of dissent. Sinicization, which no one really understands what it actually means, but we know that China is trying to compel Tibetans to conform to a Chinese cultural nationalism. And they're using new methods in which to do so, particularly targeting younger people, to break the connections between generations, to obliterate memories and knowledge of Tibet's history. And they want future generations to remember the Dalai Lama as an enemy, even as a terrorist. And in effect, what's happening in Tibet meets the NATO definition of cognitive warfare, strategies that are aimed at changing not only what people think, but how they think and how they act. So they're not only seeking to erase, but they're also seeking to reshape. And that's particularly relevant as we sit here in Britain, because Imperial Britain was unique in having signed treaties and conducted diplomatic, military relations with an independent Tibet. And from 1911 to 1949, China was on the political sidelines. Tibet was de facto independent. And due to those relationships that were forged by British India, Britain had an influence that no other Western country enjoyed. And that mattered to Tibet because British influence across the Himalayas was an important counterweight to China. So the Chinese leadership is well aware of that irrefutable political, cultural, historical connection. And they pay particular attention to how the UK government handles the issue of Tibet, just as they did when His Holiness was travelling to London. And until 2008, the UK was the only UN member to stop short of recognising China's sovereignty over Tibet and to use the term suzerainty instead, a term which very few people really understood what it meant, but it certainly meant something not sovereign. And so it was a description of Tibet's status, which was very close to how it was as a nation state at that time before the Chinese invasion. So a statement by former Foreign Secretary David Miliband under the previous Labour government, Britain renounced that position as an anachronism and as a colonial legacy in apparent deference to long-standing concern about that position from the Chinese government. And it's worth noting that Britain gained absolutely nothing from that, and Foreign Office officials even admitted that later privately. So we see that using China's language really opens the door to much more significant concessions later. So China in Tibet uses a smokescreen of opaque terminology in which to describe their policies in Tibet. For instance, they describe their policies of removing nomads, Tibetan nomads, from land they have protected for centuries as framed in terms of environmental protection, and when the opposite is true. We know that herd mobility and indigenous knowledge are critical to actually protecting the health of the grasslands and the high altitude ecosystem. So why does China do this with language? Because Tibet is very important to China, and in fact this enables us to see how Tibet has had an often overlooked strategic significance internationally. So the harsh policies in Tibet emerge from China's objectives. I'll summarize those very briefly, the main ones. Firstly, the expansion of mining based on the very rich resources of the plateau. More than 85% of PRC's hard rock lithium deposits can be found in remote eastern Tibet. That's crucial to China's supremacy in electric vehicles. And then secondly, its control over the borders. Since Xi Jinping came to power, border incursions have tripled. There was no direct and contiguous border between India and China until China took over Tibet. And generally speaking, China regards its peripheries as of central importance. And the leak of data from a commercial contractor for China's public security apparatus in February, that's a company called iSoon, revealed a real laser focus on peripheries and ethnicities, reflecting the CCP perception of threat internationally. And not only did the party state hire hackers to target diaspora networks, for instance, of course, the exile administration in Dharamsala, the data leak revealed exact individuals that they targeted in Dharamsala, but it also targeted Uyghurs in the diaspora, for instance, even in Syria, in Afghanistan, as well as official entities in Mongolia, the Foreign Ministry, and India's Customs Agency. And with a report for my new research network, Turquoise Roof, we showed, thanks to Greg Walton, who's a brilliant analyst on China's digital surveillance, that the use of these sort of intelligence tactics against diaspora populations before global deployment also suggests that these vulnerable populations, like Tibetans in Dharamsala, serve almost as laboratories and have served for China to refine its espionage capabilities. So the third point, I would say, is control over Tibet's water. You're all familiar with this issue. Tibet's the source area of Asia's major rivers. And I would say that we've had a turning point quite recently in our understanding of this in terms of the protests in Dergyeh. For the first time, China is shifting the center of its dam building efforts upstream into the highest rivers of the Tibetan Plateau, which is one of the most seismically unstable areas in in the world. Now, this is against the advice even of Chinese scientists in China. So new research in China shows that river systems are increasingly unpredictable due to climate change. And there's also a phenomenon that many of you may have heard of reservoir-induced seismicity, which is that there is strong evidence that the filling of reservoirs for dams can actually cause earthquakes, and was linked to the massive Sichuan earthquake in 2008. So this is a demonstration for the first time of how problems in Tibet, China's policies in Tibet, impact global systems. So I think that's a turning point perhaps in our communications, because this shows how Tibet has been often treated as an issue of human rights, of course, it should be, and of religious freedom, but actually it has an often overlooked strategic importance globally. And again, another use of language, China describes dam building as water conservation construction. And China uses hydro projects and associated solar and wind power to demonstrate and to signal its green transition. But China is still the world's biggest emitter of fossil fuels, and the smart grid is still oriented to fossil fuels that we've documented by mapping some of those dams and renewable stations. So actually, as well as making the argument that this dam building is devastating to Tibetans who lose their land, ancient monasteries being submerged, this is also against China's interests and the interests of countries downstream. And so it helps us to raise those arguments of Chinese scientists. That's also relevant that Ed Miliband will be traveling to China early next year, as well as the UK Chancellor. So these are the sort of arguments about climate change that we need to counter. So China's efforts to compel conformity with its language are aimed at really subverting and manipulating global discourse on Tibet. And Tibet is very important at the highest levels. Okay. China is seeking to lead great changes unseen in a century. And Xi Jinping has developed elaborate plans to achieve global political, economic, and energy dominance. And China maintaining its control over Tibet is central to those plans. And so we see China trying to draw its neighbors closer into the PRC orbit, offering trade and connectivity. And of course, India is a major target. This is research that was led by Robert Barnett and that was published recently, in which we're seeing China building cross-border villages, moving Tibetans and Chinese into Bhutan, a sovereign territory which threatens India's interests. And so that incorporates also the use of the language Xizang. China recently held in Ningtri, which is right next to the border in Arunachal Pradesh, the so-called China Xizang Himalayan Rim International Cooperation Forum, and which was seeing friendly governments to China adopting that term Xizang already. So I think I'll maybe just summarize a little of the rest. Okay. So, Nepal, maybe just, okay, this is where it's relevant. Okay, the Silk Road, which is a network of pathways extending across Eurasia, connecting east and west with Ladakh at its heart, did not only serve as a major trade route between India and China, but it also facilitated the spread of Buddhism from India to East Asia. And the CCP alternative is the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. So what they're doing is building a trade and infrastructure network connecting Asia with Europe and Africa along the ancient trade routes of the Silk Road. And I'll just summarize by saying that those plans are directly linked to China's propagation of a Chinese version of Buddhism, which is becoming increasingly evident. And that's above Dalai Lama's, and that's countering the Dalai Lama's huge global influence in the world. So while the Chinese Communist Party urges its members to be unyielding Marxist atheists, in Xi Jinping's words, it's also seeking to expand its colonial control not only over Tibet but beyond PRC borders. And this is one of the reasons why it's of such importance for us to challenge that discourse, particularly in a week when we've seen UK-China policy basically blowing up and being on the front pages. Here in the UK, the United Front Work Department has penetrated every sector of the economy. MI5, head of MI5, said that infiltration is on an epic scale. Cyber attacks, there's intimidation, there's transnational repression, there is ownership of critical infrastructure. This is a direct threat to domestic security, and it needs to be treated as such. So power projection across borders is part of a broader effort by China to secure allegiance and to secure support for Beijing's planning over the future of the Dalai Lama. So here in the UK too, we have United Front Work Department proxies like the China Buddhist Association seeking actively to undermine and to subvert relationships between Buddhists here in the UK. So I think to summarize, final sentence, sorry, so I'll just say that I think that what all of this coming together heralds is a new era. We are in a new era of geopolitical competition, and that's linked to the stability of the region. It's linked to the future of the Dalai Lama institution and Tibetan Buddhist civilization. It's linked to power relations with China. It's linked to the ability of neighboring countries and vulnerable communities to determine their own future. And it's also linked to what we want our societies to be and what sort of values we want to protect. So I'll leave it there. Sorry, that was good.
Thank you to Ms. Kate Saunders for giving us this important reminder about the relationship that Tibet has had with Britain. The numerous geopolitical reasons that China is trying to confuse and change the terminology with regards to Tibet. It's really important we think about it in all of those different contexts that you have mentioned. So our final speaker for this evening is Dr. Tsering Topgyala, who is a political scientist, as Namgyal mentioned, and he will be speaking on the historical origins of Tibet and Xizang and explaining the attempts to replace Tibet with Xizang. Dr. Tsering Topgyala.
Okay, I don't have PowerPoint slides, so I apologize for that. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for bringing us together and for giving me this platform to speak to everyone gathered here, particularly to the many young Tibetans who have assembled here today. I especially appreciate that opportunity. What I will do in the next 10 to 12 minutes is basically four things. I'll begin with a thought exercise, and then I will go on to talk about the origins of the word Tibet and Xizang and the geographical meanings behind those terms. And then I will try to put China's attempts to replace Tibet with Xizang in the context of its broader policies towards minority groups like the Tibetans and Uyghurs, and particularly within the broad program of sinicization that China is trying to achieve in Tibet and in other places. And then, ending with some observations on what motivates China in trying to replace Tibet with Xizang. So the thought exercise is this. Might be quite provocative and even controversial. I would like everyone to imagine an old person, a very old person, old man or woman, it's up to you, and that old person is stricken with age and disease. You can see open wounds and scars of torture and attacks by enemies, but you also observe on the face of that person the sorrow and despair of being used, abused, and discarded by loved ones. Yeah? Who do you think that person is? Who do you think I have in mind when I'm asking you to visualize such a person? Any suggestions? Yes, I have Tibet in mind, right? An ancient nation weighed down by history, weighed down by attacks and ravages from foreign assailants, colonial and imperial forces, and also weighed down by the inaptitude and betrayal by his own sons and daughters in many respects, right? So what I would like you to imagine next is a certain avian creature of the scavenging type. I don't want to use the actual words because I know Namgyal had to sign a form, to confirm that I'm not a very controversial person, right? So you know what I'm referring to, right? So there are many of those creatures circling around that person, that old person. And at the forefront, at the front of the queue of these scavenging creatures is, of course, China, the colonial imperial power, in Tibet. And our meeting here is to talk about what China is doing to Tibet in broad terms, but particularly what motivates China in trying to replace Tibet with Xizang. But China is not the only creature circling around Tibet. You will see, international institutions like mainstream museums in France or UK trying to essentially do China's beating and changing the language, referring to Tibet. You see Tibet scholars trying to change what is the International Association for Tibetan Studies into Association of Himalayan Studies, right? But closer to home, there are Tibetans who are also part of that drama. If you see Tibetans who put their regions or their sects above Tibet or Tibetan national identity, if you see them organizing along those lines, if you see them advising their children and friends and to hate Tibetans from other regions or other sects, they're all participating in this drama, right, of trying to kill off Tibet. Tibet in the sense of a national idea as well as the geographical or physical form of Tibet, right? So I don't have the time to get into all the details, and we are gathered here to talk about what China is doing and why China is, trying to replace Tibet with Xizang, right? So in that regard, in terms of the origin of the word Tibet, China obviously makes the point that it is trying to replace Tibet with Xizang because from their perspective, Tibet is a Western construction, and imposition. And China is trying to decolonize, the policies around Tibet by replacing what is a Western construct with a Chinese name, right? But in actual reality, it is not a Western construct, right? Xiaojiang gave a more granular sort of presentation on what were the different words that Chinese used over the decades and centuries. Essentially, you can say that up until the Qing dynasty, in the 18th century, the most common word for Tibet was Tibet in China. Right? If you look at the Tang dynasty records or the Song and the Ming dynasty records, Tibet was the most common word used for Tibet. The imperial edicts, diplomatic records, as well as the dynastic histories. You see Tibet as the most common word used for Tibet in China. And that is not the only example. If you look at India, the ancient name for Tibet in Sanskrit and other languages is Tibet, right? If you look at the historical records of the Persian Empire or the Arabic Empire, Tibet or some variation was the ancient name for Tibet, right? And then you go to Mongolia, the ancient Mongol records, during the Yuan dynasty, Tibet was the name for Tibet, right? And that at one of the most common sort of syllables is per, right? Which is the Tibetan name for Tibet, right? So it is a name derived from Tibetan usage, a Tibetan name, as well as in the name used by neighbors for Tibet over centuries, right? So then if you come to Xizang, the word Xizang, Xizang only comes into picture during the Qing dynasty, during the 18th century and onwards. And obviously there's a lot of background detail, which I can't go into the details. So that is sort of the, and when the Qing dynasty and today's China use Xizang to refer to Tibet, we need to understand it only refers to what is called Tibet Autonomous Region. Right? It doesn't include Tibetan regions, in Amdo, Kham, and Gyalrong, right? So we need to keep that in mind. So in terms of why China is doing it, particularly after Xi Jinping came to power, he was bombarded by recommendations from Chinese scholars and intellectuals to reform policies towards minority groups like the Tibetans, because of what they observed in Tibet in 2008, and then even in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. There were many scholars and intellectuals who said, we need to reform our policies. And part of their recommendation, and the recommendation taken on board by Xi Jinping, was to sinicize these groups in various forms, right? So when the previous president Hu Jintao, when he was the party secretary in Tibet in 1989, he presided over a policy called grasping with two hands on Tibet. But on the one hand, using ruthless crackdown against any form of dissent. On the other hand, using economic development and modernization to win over Tibetans, right? So Xi Jinping essentially added a third element to that, which is sinicization, a very sort of programmatic form of sinicization, right? So you hear this word sinicization a lot, right? But a lot of people don't understand the exact detail of what is involved. So 2 minutes, yeah. So sinicization happens in many forms. On the one hand, there's the daily forms of sinicization, where you have to put up the portraits of the Chinese leaders in the homes, and you see Chinese flags all over the place, on the rooftops, on the streets, these daily forms of sinicization, which has been going on for many decades. And then you see also the psychological attempts to remake Tibetans. You hear about the boarding schools, where Tibetans are taught in Chinese for the most part, and various forms of restrictions against teaching and learning Tibetan, right? You hear about the sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. But you also see Chinese sinicization of Tibetan history. When they talk about Tibetan assimilation of Indian Buddhism in the 9th or 10th century, now they are being described as sinicization of Buddhism. And then you see also China trying to appropriate Tibetan culture, like the Kesar epic, Thangka painting, Tibetan medicine. All of these are now being appropriated as Chinese culture, right? Not just Tibetan culture. So, and one of the final sort of form of sinicization is rectification of name, right? Which is what Xizang, changing Tibet to Xizang is. Obviously, there is a lot of theoretical sort of background to that, but essentially, this is what China is trying to do: rectification of name. And why China is doing that? Because Tibet, as a word, evokes an imagination of a land that is very distinct from China or Chinese culture, has a historical identity, as well as a current identity as something separate from, from China, right? So there's the historical background, as well as contemporary sort of image of Tibet as distinct from China, right? So replacing that with Xizang removes, as Xing Shak said, some of the anxiety and fears about that. And then it's an attempt to rewrite Tibetan history, and in the process, rewriting China's so-called national history, where Tibet is inseparably part of the Chinese nation and under Chinese sovereignty, right? And it is also an attempt to undermine the demands of the Tibetans for unification of Tibet. Remember when His Holiness talked with the Chinese leaders, there were two key demands, one of which was to get genuine autonomy, and the second demand is unification of all the Tibetan regions into one administrative unit, right? So replacing Tibet with Xizang is an attempt to undermine that lack of the Tibetan demand. And then it's also to undermine international support for Tibet. So there's a lot more that I can say, but we are out of time. So during the Q&A, I can answer more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tsering Topgilla. I think the thought-provoking imagery that you used to parallel the situation of Tibet's history and identity being attacked by China and other elements is really powerful. And I think it was very useful for many of our audience today to think about it in this imaginative way. So I want to thank all the panelists for all of your insights. I would like to now start the question and answer session. So I'd like to request the audience to start thinking about any questions you have, as we will soon be opening the floor to the questions. May I request that you all say your name and then your question, as we would like to collect 3 questions at a time and then give a chance for our panelists to answer the questions. Before I move on, do we want to stay here or do we want to move to the chairs for the discussion? What would you prefer?
Whatever you
What about, would that be better? Is this okay? Maybe we stay here actually, because in terms of if you want to jot down notes, it might be easier actually. Okay, so let's do that. So before I open the floor, I have a quick question, and then I'll be asking Namgyala to pass on this mic so that we can capture your questions. So my question is, the use of the use of Xizang outside of China feels kind of like it's insidiously crept up on us, but it's so prominent now. Have you got any thoughts or ideas when the use of Xizang has been so widely pushed by China, especially in the wider global context, and also any advice about what we as Tibetans or Tibet supporters can do to try and tackle this issue.
I think in regard to when China started pushing the international community to use Xizang instead of Tibet, I think 2003. Although I can't point to a specific sort of legislation or regulation, the consensus more or less is that it happened sometime in 2023. And that's, although Xizang, as a word existed, as early as the 18th century. But China's sort of this decision to replace Tibet with Xizang in its communication with the rest of the world really took off in 2023. Although I heard that around 2018, 2019, there were suggestions by Chinese sort of delegations to the National People's Congress to do that. But it's really sort of started in 2023. With regards to what Tibetans can do, obviously what happened in France with regards to the museums, replacing Tibet with Xizang or the Himalayan world, is sort of an example for us. We need to be vigilant, whether it's in the academic sort of world or in other public forums or institutions. We need to be vigilant and sort of organize and try to force these institutions, if they are adopting Chinese sort of language on Tibet. And with regards to, for example, the attempts by Tibet scholars, for example, to replace the International Association for Tibetan Studies with Himalayan Studies, they were pushed back by a number of Tibetan scholars as well as other scholars to retain that some years ago. So these are examples of what Tibetans and others can do, being vigilant and pushing back, and producing language material, right? Whether it's academic publications or literature in general, or writing in the newspapers, and being out there on the public forum to produce content as well as literature or other sort of material with Tibetan representation and the language that Tibetans would prefer, right? Not just sort of observe everything on the TV and on the computer from home, and expecting someone else to do it for us. Now that Tibetans have been in Western countries for some time, and they are second or third generation Tibetans, coming up, you need to sort of try to be in positions of power and influence, whether it's in the journalism, academia, or any walk of life. We need Tibetans to be present there and be in positions of power and influence.
Kate?
So I think this argument about what constitutes Tibet, and not only the use of the term Xizang, has always been really relevant in our communications. And I remember so many occasions, for instance, in 2008, when Tibet was such a global news story, so prominent in the international news agenda. And the BBC was describing Kham and Amdo as, part of China. And some of you in this room who are old friends going back to the 1990s will remember the World Bank campaign back in the late 90s. Jane Capel there was at Tibet Information Network. Well, a little bit after that, Jane, sorry. But I remember we saw a note in Chinese media that the World Bank was funding a project in Dulan County in Qinghai. And at the time, I got on the phone to the World Bank to try to find out, because we knew it was a Tibetan area. And the problem with it, the World Bank person who answered the phone told me all about it because he didn't realize that was Tibet. He said, there's no sensitivities here, this isn't Tibet. And so we communicated later to them that, well, do you think His Holiness the Dalai Lama is Tibetan? He's from Amdo, which is this area. So it's always been a concern to communicate in media and on international platforms, you know, what is Tibet? Tibet is not only the Tibet Autonomous Region. By the way, the V&A, in their signage, they're not using Xizang as far as I'm aware, but they are describing Tibet as only TAR, which is about half the area that constitutes Tibet. So I think with regard to the UK language, the change in language, we now have an international lawyer as Prime Minister. And so that provides a very strong platform to argue for a course correct on language used about Tibet, because if Britain is going to rip up that what was effectively a legal agreement, then what other historic legal agreements could they rip up? And some of you, again, going back to the 1990s, late 1990s, when the then party secretary Jiang Zemin came to the UK. I don't know if any of you remember how Tibet protesters had their banners confiscated, and the police moved white vans in front of some of the protests. And Free Tibet did a very ingenious campaign then, which was to get the Met Police to acknowledge that China's security had told them to do that, and also to get an apology from the Met Police. And they succeeded, and that was quite a groundbreaking demonstration. And the young barrister who was acting for the Tibetan side was a young Keir Starmer. So that's certainly a connection that could be exploited in future dialogues. So I think also to point out that if you start using this language, if you start using China's language, it's the same with the use of minorities. Tibetans are not minorities, Uyghurs are not minorities. That's inaccurate and wrong. And again, you have a legal lawyer should be concerned about the use of that language. So I think to show that the UK and other countries that adopt that language are in effect they're losing leverage. You're losing your sort of heft in other diplomatic spheres. So, and I think around the time of COVID, there was probably a realization among many Western governments that this was happening, and a bit of a sea change in approach to China.
Thank you, Kate. And Dr. Xiao?
So this very important terminology is the Tibetan. This is called the Tibet, or the Tibetan call themselves Bo. It's no problem. They very clear historical, culture, religion, political science. But the problem that what is Xizang is a problem. If you talk the Xizang, because if you talk the Chinese translation, there actually is a different translation. We can reference when the Chinese government talk about Xizang, the Taiwanese talk about Tubo. The Tubo very close. It's just to follow a Tibetan language, Bo, and it's a Tubo. Is called for example, the Tibetan writer. They use this name. The Weiser use this name. It's very important. If you in English language, no problem. The Chinese language, because the Chinese government try to use this language to dominate this Tibetan cause. That is a problem. So if you talk about the Tibetan, where is Xizang they try to put into the international discourse. Actually, you said a very important time is in 2003. Why is it 2003? Because it's a Chinese government uses the develop the West, the 开发大西北. It means it's try to get the Tibetan land and the sources very important for their for the strong state for the Chinese Communist Party. This is the point. Then also they use this word is together is sovereignty over human right. What is sovereignty for the Chinese government? Actually, the sovereignty means only regime and authority. You must, if you use this word, you must challenge the other Chinese Communist Party use word. This one, and second, they use is develop is human rights, and that is actually overlapping. The sum is the political figure in democratic countries because they use this older law, and you can push this maybe very dialogue with the Chinese government, and also use this stability development, and also use maybe the other word as anti-terrorism and extremism. They also, the Chinese government try to give the new a new meaning for this one. This actually they put together, not only use the Xizang. They try to use this word and change international law and the international law standard and push the Chinese Communist Party, the emperor in the world. That is must talk about it. Second, maybe we trace our case when Xi Jinping with the UK. Because after I had two Tibetan protest arrest and search home, and that is means that you can ask the question: who decided the British foreign policy since the 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party established the state, People of the Republic of China? That is actually, you can look. I asked Sunday around maybe 100 freedom of information question to the government, to a rural house. Normally, the government don't want to reply the very important question. Who decide they use this, the Chinese influence in Britain? Because the Chinese asked the British government and police and just suspend the Human Rights Act. And also they push the protest 5 mile around Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping cannot look the slogan and cannot listen to this chanting. That is for just protect Xi Jinping's face. That's very important because if you look at the British foreign policy, actually is controlled by 48 club group for British big companies. And since the 1950s, like that one, even you talk about labor, conservative, doesn't matter. They only talk about profit for the elite group in UK. So I think it's a very limitation. If you just lobby parliament and something, you must maybe first they change the people's mind. They change the terminology. When you talk the maybe Chinese government, you must stand some standard. What is the international law? For Tibetan, how can use this law? How can protect the Tibetan basic rights? For example, the self-determination and other cultural rights, religion rights, and political rights. That's very, very important. You can reference, talk with maybe cooperate the Taiwan and other maybe inside Chinese have some of the Tibetan culture awareness, these people. That is very important. They give the different version. Otherwise, maybe just like the diploma is a language game. Like this, just the Chinese government and the Western government, they made some human rights dialogue and the economic strategy dialogue for 30 years. Nothing changed. That is still here. Tibetan cannot change from the below. They must listen to inside the Tibetan and the Tibetan community exiled speech, and other Taiwanese and Chinese have some Tibetan cultural awareness. The people give us some idea. Thank you.
Could I make just one
Yeah,
quick
of
thing
course,
about,
please do.
just to flag up one thing about Xiaojiang has been on the front lines of seeking accountability, and another recommendation I would make is some sort of rights-based interrogation, investigation into United Front Work Department activities in the UK is long overdue. Xiaojiang, when he was detained by British police back in 2015, then pursued accountability after that, which is an extremely important exercise, I think. So.
Excellent. Thank you all. So we'll now open the panel to, we'll open the questions up to our audience. If anyone has a question, can you please raise your hand? Namgye will come round with the mic. And can I request again that you say your name and then your question? And if your question is directed to a particular panelist, you can also mention that. If it's open to the whole panel, then that's also fine. And if a couple of you can put your hands up, then we know who to get the questions from, and we can note them down as well.
Yeah, my name's Helly. My question is to the whole panel, but it's so good to be in a round table with one of the leaders of the Tiananmen Square resistance. So I agree with all of the points which the panel made about the ideological constructs which China is using in this kind of arena, and the kind of securitization and all the rest of it. But I still feel that the panel didn't address the issue as to why China is doing this. And I think that this was touched upon by Kate when she mentioned the role of the UK in all of these areas. Now, if you look at all of the conflicts in the world today, the UK has their fingerprints over a lot of them, you know, in Palestine, in Iraq, in many other countries, the US as well. And my question is, how are we opposing China? How are we trying to oppose China if we're also reinforcing the narrative of the UK, the US, and the EU? Because these are countries which have blood on their hands. You know, they are stained with all of the atrocities that have been committed in these areas. So if we want to defend human rights as we need to do, how are we going to defend human rights against the abuse committed by China while simultaneously recognizing the kind of atrocities that we have been committing and continue to commit? I mean, the latest example is the agreement in Chagos, you know? I mean, that agreement which we're fostering is an absolute abomination.
My name is Yuri Stoyanov. I have a concrete question to the whole panel. I wonder how this policies, heritage policies concerning the name change, etc., being enacted in the China Ethnic Cultures Museum, or the Museum of Nationalities, which is in the Olympic Park, because obviously that's kind of a one of the vehicles of that kind of propaganda. And as far as I know, there are some British projects which currently are underway in collaboration with this particular museum, which probably should be, discussed. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lose, and my question is, how do countries like India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and other neighboring countries navigate the use of Xizang in official communications, given their historic ties to Tibet and the Tibetan exiled leadership? And that's open to the whole panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with these 3 questions. I'll give you a couple of seconds to jot down anything, and then we can see how we want to start.
Okay, maybe I first answer. I try to answer the question because I think if you talk the Chinese government, you must understand what is the strategy they try to attempt. For example, Indian normally they talk Tibetan issue. The China talk about the Kashmir issue. That's quite like the football game. That's very important. The Indian, Nepal, and Bhutan is much. They have some of the standard. They understand what is the international law, gives some the Tibetan space. For example, if you talk about the use the Xizang, maybe the Indian and Nepal, or not like the Nepal, the prime minister visit Beijing just to follow Chinese government say, okay, Xizang, in his statement. They can say, okay, I use the other word, the Taiwanese use words, it's Tubo. This very simple thing. I like this simple because it's they can ask maybe say, okay, we first ask Tibetan people, what is your language use? I try to translation your language. But I think the Taiwanese translation very, very good. The meaning and also respect the Tibetan issue. It's quite a good translation. You can learn from the Chinese. It's Tubo. And you can say, okay, you talk Xizang, we talk Tubo. We not the same thing, but actually the basic things the same about the Tibetan self-determination and the cultural rights and other things. That's very important.
Okay, so there are 3 huge questions, and we could talk for hours about every single one. The gentleman at the back, yes, I agree, and I think this is the British Empire has blood on its hands in Palestine and in so many other places in the world, and I know that even people inside the system who are trying to encourage better policies towards countries like China and Russia are very well aware of this. So I think the arguments about our moral authority as democratic nations are perhaps less relevant now to the global fight against authoritarianism and the ways in which a hostile axis of countries, China, Russia, North Korea, Israel, in which other countries are trying to enforce their power, the state power, in a very hostile way, and influence our own societies, of course, as well. So it's one of the arguments for looking at Tibet as a more strategic concern of interest to all of us. And I think also the Dalai Lama has been a unique leader on a global stage, and that needs to be respected as well. The Dalai Lama institution has become a global one because he's got influence across Asia and across the world and in our Western societies. And he's been a very active, very strong proponent of using Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan civilization as a means of engaging with the world's problems rather than running away from them or despairing about them. And he's done that in very practical ways. We've seen the way that his teachings on emotional intelligence and the importance of compassion, you can say the compassion is the Dalai Lama's brand, so to speak. His emphasis on global interdependence and on green issues as well have been very influential worldwide. So he's showing that Tibetan civilization is of value beyond Tibet-China relations, and it's relevant to the world as it grapples with multiple crises. So I think it's not an argument. The despair and very natural concern and knowledge that has become much more evident recently of impacts of empire and so on, and historical cycles, should not be a reason. It should not be mutually exclusive for trying to do the right thing now, I guess. And I think it calls for a different type of engagement by Britain and by Western countries, the EU, America, a different form of engagement that recognises that Tibet and the future of the Dalai Lama institution and the cultural survival of Tibetan Buddhism, which has so much to offer in the 21st century and has strengths as well as vulnerabilities. I think to platform those as an answer to the world's problems, and not as something that we should only be despairing of China for what it's doing. In terms of, I'll try and give a short answer to the question about India, Nepal and other countries. Of course, the Dalai Lama's influence across all of these countries under the Dalai Lama's leadership ever since he escaped in 1959. India has become a major global centre of Tibetan Buddhism. And there's something like 300,000 monks. There's a huge sort of, 30,000. I'm not going to even mention the figures because I'll get it wrong. But it's extremely important now. Buddhist presence, the Dalai Lama's presence there has given a lot to India. In the past, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, India has adopted a somewhat transactional position towards the Dalai Lama and Tibet, often with the policy establishment referring to the Dalai Lama and Tibet as a sort of obstacle rather than viewing it as a strategic asset. There are signs that that is starting to change, and India certainly hasn't adopted the terminology on Xizang, and it hasn't signed up to Belt and Road. Nepal has already adopted and made significant concessions to China and has signed up to the Belt and Road. But again, a sign of Tibetan strength and resilience. In Nepal itself, there's a new generation of Tibetan religious leaders who have a real power centre, I think, in Kathmandu, and who are attracting people from all over the world. So this matters to Nepal as well. And there's some concerns in Nepal that their sovereignty may be compromised by China as well. So Bhutan now, very interesting strategic significance situation unfolding there. And let's not also forget Mongolia, which is the largest free Tibetan Buddhist population in the world, even more than Tibet, and which is subject to immense pressure from its very powerful neighbours, China and Russia, particularly China, which seeks to ensure control over its minerals, over its cultural business elite, and where the Dalai Lama, as most of you know, has just recognised a young child as the Jetsun Dampa or Bogd Lama, the spiritual leader of Mongolia. So that situation is unfolding very dynamic way. So
I'll try to briefly answer all three questions. On the first question about Western sort of colonialism, imperialism, or neo-imperialism versus Chinese atrocities in Tibet. First of all, as Kate said, there's no doubt that what the British and the Americans and other Western countries did, in history, is deplorable and should be, called out. And in fact, I would say that Tibet came out the worst among all the regions and countries that were affected by British imperialism, right? Many countries, that exist today, whether it's India or Malaysia or Pakistan or many countries, were actually created as a result of British or European imperialism, right? And when decolonization happened, many of those countries, despite all the atrocities and ravages of Western colonialism and imperialism, they were left behind with some institutions, infrastructure projects, educational systems, and so on and so forth. Tibet was affected by British imperialism in many ways. And in fact, even when Tibet was de facto independent, the reason why Tibet was not recognized as such has to do with British duplicity. And the reason why the Qing dynasty invaded Tibet, from Sichuan in 1908, 1909, was because of the British invasion of Tibet in 1904, 1903, right? So, and when the British left India, they washed their hands completely off Tibet and, delegated all the responsibilities and rights to India, which was a new country and unprepared. So Tibetans have a lot of grievances, if you want to make grievances. But it's not always helpful to, try to create this equivalence between, what the Western countries did and, what China is doing today. China was as imperialist and colonialist as the Western countries and Japan, in the 19th century and early 20th century. The only reason why they were not that successful was because they were less powerful, less effective as colonial and imperialist countries. Look what they tried to do in Tibet in the 1906 to 1910 period, in Xinjiang, in also Korea during the dying sort of moments of the Qing dynasty, under the leadership of Han Chinese officials. So we need to make sure that we two wrongs don't make it right, right? And it's not always helpful to bring Western sort of atrocities when they are not relevant. What we are talking about is Tibetan grievances. In fact, Britain today doesn't care about Tibet at all. All of these grievances or issues about China replacing Tibet to Xinjiang is not coming from any Western countries. They are principally coming from Tibetans, whether they are inside Tibet or from outside. So these are Tibetan grievances, right? So it's not always helpful to bring up some kind of whataboutism and moral equivalence. Although we have to always call out Western atrocities, both in history or what they're doing today. But Western countries don't care that much about what's happening in Tibet. Whether they would be quite happy to adopt China's language, call Xizang instead of Tibet. So the second question about Chinese ethnic museum, I think we need to sort of separate two issues. One is what language Chinese use to refer to Tibet in their own communication, in intra-Chinese communication or publications, with what China is trying to do internationally, which is to replace Tibet with Xizang, right? China has different names for other countries. They call America Mego, or England is Ingo. They use these kind of names, in their sort of documents or in their communications. So most Tibetans don't have any problem with China using Xizang when they are, communicating with each other, when they are talking about Tibet. What the problem is, when China is trying to impose Xizang to the international audience. So if they are using Xizang in a museum in Beijing or any Chinese cities to talk about Tibet, is not a problem. I don't think many Tibetans would have a problem with that. The second question about neighboring countries, although we can talk about this at home more, Kate, I think, answered to some extent. I think Nepal is most susceptible, and since the late 1980s, Nepal's policies towards Tibetans have been, dictated by the Chinese in many ways. And the reason why China is competing with India over influence in Nepal is because of the Tibet issue. But particularly because the ruling party in Nepal is Communist Party, they are much more sort of susceptible to adopting Chinese language, and they have already started doing that. India has, because it's a much powerful actor, has very sort of different interests vis-a-vis India, has resisted Chinese efforts to, for example, control the political activities of the Tibetans in India. India has been, resistant and will resist using that kind of language to talk about Tibet, unless relations between India and China improve to a greater extent. Bhutan is interesting because it is in a relationship with India that is close to a protectorate, right? So Bhutan is very reliant on India for security and defense purposes, and Bhutan is culturally Tibetan, right? Whether in religion or in language, and so there are lots of ties between Tibetans and Bhutanese, and Bhutan does not have a formal relationship with China, right? Again, decades down the line, if the bilateral relations changes, between Bhutan and China, for instance, we might see, some changes. But for the moment, I don't see Bhutan actively adopting Chinese, language.
So may I make one point? About the Palestine issue is the big issue for the PR China, the first country recognized Palestine, that use this one and the weapon against the Western country, and they try to get some seat in UN during that time, 1960s. This is very important. I remember the one thing, Hu Jintao visited UK when the Tibetan protest Hu Jintao. The one is maybe the British, they said, why you protest China? China becomes the superpower and better the world, because otherwise only the US can dominate the world. That are the question to the one Tibetan protest. I asked, say, why the Tibetans, they have the independent idea. Why they protest China colony and the imperialism. Why they don't cannot? Why they use they means the employee say that it means if you protest China, it means you use by the United States the power and against China. But I say the Tibetan they have their own causes for the self-determination. It's not like the Western tiger and the tiger in East. They can very easy negotiation. If you talk about the imperialism, China also imperialism, and they occupy the Tibet. Why the Tibetans have no right to protest the imperialism? The same thing. If you talk about the Palestine issue, the China always say, okay, Palestine have the self-determination. Why you don't recognize the Tibetans? They have their self-determination, why they deny the Tibetan rights self-determination. Right, thank you.
We've got a question. Let me just.
I've got one.
One second. Name and question, please.
Hi, my name is Pempa. So I wanted to ask about just in the context of all of this and the use of Xizang, for instance, with the museum in Paris. When we're faced with this sort of situation, and we are bound to be more and more going down the line, and in the context of all the younger Tibetans especially, and really mobilizing the community, how do we, what narrative do we come up with a compelling way of getting the message across to Tibet supporters, institutions, as well as governments across the world, of how do we sell it to them in making it clear to them that the cause of Tibet is a worthwhile fight over and above their economic interests, which is a very strong force, and this is what China is obviously leveraging on. How do we overcome that, and how can we get that message across to Tibetans, the younger generation, to really find a collective voice within the Tibetans, and enough of a strength in the voice in the collective, rather than a few individual experts who are able to communicate that in a good way? How do we try and get that across to a wider Tibetan audience?
Hello, my name's Damien, and can you guys hear me, by the way? Does this work? Yeah? Good. It's just to add on to Pampala's question, which is if there is any particular groups, people or organizations, governments that we could be or we should be prioritizing. This is coming from somebody who's from the voluntary Tibetan advocacy group, so we all volunteer our free time, excuse me. And so naturally we have a very limited amount of time as a resource on our hands, and people, financial resources, etc. as well. So in terms of prioritization, what would that look like for organizations, people, etc.? Thank you.
We have already covered some sort of issues in relation to what Tibetans and others can do on this specific issue, right? But I think I want to emphasize two things. Which goes back to the thought exercise I did, particularly about Tibetans as well being complicit in destroying Tibet. We spend a lot of time arguing among Tibetans, whether it's along regional lines or sectarian lines, and even minor issues about what type of Gorshe is Tibetan or not. We spend so much time arguing with each other over insignificant things, right? And this sort of division and fragmentation goes beyond minor issues like Gorshe, all the way to the political institutions in exile, right? So we need to overcome these kind of divisions and fragmentation and focus more on broader challenges such as what China is trying to do and what other international actors are doing in relation to Tibet or not doing, right? And number two, I would emphasize younger Tibetans to try to achieve positions of power and influence in Western countries, whatever countries they are, whether it's journalism, it's politics, or academia, whatever it is. Try to achieve positions of power and influence so that you can set the agenda. You can try to shape policies and positions. So I would emphasize these two. But see if others have anything to add.
Okay, because it's you talk about this problem, the Chinese Communist Party uses the propaganda and brainwash for long time, seven decades for Chinese. So we just set up the unofficial Chinese archive, because it's very important that such I talk about this archive, also the including how the people should understand the Tibetan issue. Not is the Chinese follow the Chinese government historical narrative and the other story. We must they have the different story, and also some of the Tibetan they can write some Chinese, and we collect some of the article and the book, put this archive, and this can dialogue with the Tibetan people and other people about the Tibetan issue. Very important. I think maybe Tibetan also they can make some archive and the narrative, the historical issue and the religion issue and the political issue from maybe the recent 7 decades. They're very important. Is inside and the ground root, the narrative, keep this history, and this people, the young generation can understand why it happened in history, why the Chinese government use this strategy, still can influence so many people. This very important, the historical discounts and collect the archive, and the young generation can have communication, the other generation and other Tibetan scholar and activities in history. That is keep the Tibetan struggle forever, in the future.
So I would say, in answer to those questions, a lot of it is about creating a compelling story and developing strategic communications and advocacy, and often timing is everything. Often it's inserting a particular message into a particular news cycle in such a way that it will amplify that message. I would also say it's about celebrating and demonstrating Tibetan culture and His Holiness, the strength, the resilience, and the relevance, as well as pointing out and monitoring the rights abuses and the suffering. Because actually this is a culture that is very powerful. It has a lot of soft power. The Dalai Lama has a lot of power and a lot of influence. That's why China describes this as a complex and challenging period for China. And for China too, outcomes are not certain. They are revealing, more recently, political weaknesses. And their narrative over Tibet, for instance, over Tibet's sovereignty, is being challenged very prominently on the world stage in certain areas. We saw the Resolve Tibet Act in the States in July, which did not accept China's narrative over sovereignty over Tibet. And that was a very significant acknowledgement. They accepted that Tibet had been part of China only because of its control mechanisms since the 1950s. So I think to point out to governments that they will lose leverage if they adopt China's language and frameworks. And governments already, there has been a pushback against China since COVID. That's going to continue. There's a lot more awareness now within countries that China is trying to shape our societies. China is part of an authoritarian axis of hostile state actors in the world that we face today. And as we all know in this room, we have genocide of the Uyghurs. We have genocide in Gaza. We have North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. We have China collaborating with Russia, the strategic partnership, the partnership without limits, as Xi Jinping framed it to Putin. So Tibetans fight, just like the Ukrainians, is all of us. It's for all of us as well. It's for how we want our societies to be. And I think also we have, of course, the climate emergency, and we have Tibet's central role in that. So a lot of it is about looking at new ways in which we can show Tibet as part of a much bigger global framework, and developing and collaborating and thinking critically and reflecting along those lines. By the way, I don't know if any of you have heard of an extremely good author called Timothy Schneider. He's been on the front lines of the fight against authoritarianism. He's an expert on Russia. He's been very active in countering Trump's America as well, and the strategies of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And he wrote a very good book which I advise to every young Tibetan to read. It's called On Tyranny. One of his main arguments, he gave practical, strategic, grounded principles for resisting tyranny, which apply in our own societies as well as fighting China. And one of the first was do not obey in advance. And what Britain was doing when it changed that language on Tibet was obeying in advance, the sort of preemptive cringe to China. And so I think we can show them again and again that that's not going to serve their interests. And the other thing that Timothy Schneider agreed, among other measures, that he put forward, among other measures, were exactly what everybody is doing here in this room and what you do as a part of VTAG efforts, which is collaborating and coordinating and developing and building community networks and independent thinking and independent journalism, and also meeting face to face, not just arguing online and not just repeating positions online and whipping up anger and emotions, but actually having dialogue face to face. And isn't that what His Holiness always wanted us to do anyway? So that's what you're doing.
Thank you all for your really thoughtful and engaging questions. And I think this has actually ended in a very positive and encouraging note from our speakers as well. For the interest of time, I will then now move on actually for our vote of thanks. And I would like to now invite Tinzi Dardin, who's a young and enthusiastic VTAG member. She'll be doing the vote of thanks and kata offering.
So, good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers for sharing their invaluable insights during today's discussion, and so we would like to give some katas to you to show our gratitude. First of all, Dr. Xiaojiang, thank you for breaking down the evolution of Tibet, Bod, and Xizang from both linguistic and historical perspectives, and showcasing how these perspectives are utilized to reinforce China's regime. Your analysis of how the CCP manipulates the presentation of Tibetan culture to convert the global conversation of the Tibetan issue was deeply insightful, so thank you very much for that. And of course, Ms. Kate Saunders, your presentation situating the issues of Tibet's colonial naming within a geopolitical context, especially as His Holiness approaches his 90th birthday, was both timely and impactful. Also, your reflections on the unique relationships between Tibet and Britain was deeply beneficial, especially amongst the ongoing UK-China policy debates. I think that really adds an essential dimension to how we shape our views on these discussions moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Tsiring Tokyela, thank you for tracing the historical and geographical origins of Tibet and Xizang. Understanding these contexts are extremely vital in understanding China's efforts to establish and both expand their broader Sinicization efforts. Your insights provided critical clarity on a very complex issue, so thank you. Also, a special thank you to Dr. Tara Lamo, today's moderator, and our VTAG National Coordinator, for guiding this discussion. Your contributions were instrumental in making this event possible and allowed for a very engaging passage of dialogue, so thank you very much. I also wanted to extend gratitude to Namgyal Samuels, who I don't see right now, but he's our TTB Youth Coordinator and is also the president of the LSE Tibet Society, who has made it possible to host this event at such a prestigious institution like LSE. So please reach out to him to host future events at venues like this. It is incredibly important that Tibetans have platforms in spaces as esteemed as this, and we are truly thankful for his dedication. And also want to say a very big thank you to the Londonney team for organising and also filming this event. It will be uploaded on the channel if anyone wants to watch it later, so that's great. And lastly, of course, a very big thank you to everyone who came here today. Thank you for your time, your engagement, and your commitment to amplifying Tibetan voices. These conversations are really vital, and your participation means the world, so thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming. We do have some refreshments outside and it's a chance to further talk and mingle. And we will also have our panelists there after